Hello, I'm Neil Bindemann. I'm pleased to be back with you here in the third and final part of a series of talks on nourishing a world of wellness through the rebalancing of emotional health. In those first two parts, we looked at the aspect of the term etiology, which is about the causes of diseases and illnesses, and explored the idea of readdressing that word because of the fact that the etiology is based on something called the germ theory, and the fact that this is a theory that's being challenged a lot more these days. And as a result, we explored the idea of a different meaning for the word and a different spelling for the word etiology as well. Then we looked at some of the science to explore why emotional health is very important, and then some of the science to talk about the link with the neurochemicals and the involvement of neurochemicals in triggering emotions and causing emotions, and how that links into the balancing of our emotional health. And in this third part, this last part, we're going to look at how does the science of what we've been exploring in the first two parts relate to Parkinson's and maybe other areas where dopamine is certainly involved. So, a mind that's receptive to an emotional experience involving dopamine can lead to a body that can increase expression of receptors for dopamine. And a mind that's receptive to an emotional experience involving dopamine also places demands on the brain to continue producing and releasing dopamine, hence the numbers and increasing numbers of molecules of dopamine that you see in this image, along with the additional receptor. It is that person's behaviors, though, that link to their emotions that leads to a need for that dopamine. The person is becoming more receptive, i.e. they're becoming addicted to the bodily feelings and they're experienced when dopamine binds to the receptors expressed across the body, rewarding mind. So the loop will continue. Now, the main emotion and bodily sensation that can become associated with being very receptive to the release of dopamine, well, that is comfort. And that is a feeling, an emotion that many people with Parkinson's are familiar with. And along with that comfort comes comfortable behaviors. Question mark, because of the nature of what I'm going to show you. Comfortable behaviors in the sense that not doing an awful lot, and comfortable diets in that this is very much about what I term comfort eating. But in terms of exploring this further and understanding the whole situation, it's important to ask this question: why? Why is it that people are drawn to these sorts of behaviors? Perhaps it would help to offer a word that can be associated with comfort, and that word is pleasure. Now, if we look at what lies at the opposite end of the spectrum of that word and that experience, then often it's pain. And that's pain that's felt in the body and also can be felt, experienced in the mind. People do not only become conditioned by mind to comfort, but also there is this hiding. Hide is very similar to the word avoid. And that word avoid is really related to avoidance. That is a word that has real significance when it comes to the likes of Parkinson's and people's feelings and behaviors, because it's very strongly connected to this word, apathy. And as you will see from the research, up to 46% of people diagnosed with Parkinson's report apathy as one of the most common experiences. I would hazard a guess that this is quite low compared to having spoken to a number of people in the past and looked into this in more detail. What's the main emotion and behavior that can become associated with being very receptive to the release of dopamine? Well, we've touched on that word, but the actual behavior, in a way, is comfort seeking. And as that behavior continues and we get increased levels of dopamine receptors going up and increasing dopamine, etc., that leads to a sense of burnout, i.e. the cells producing dopamine can get burnt out. And I don't know if you all recall what the etiology, the standard definition for the etiology of Parkinson's is in terms of what I previously described, but it's caused by a loss of nerve cells in part of the brain called the substantia nigra. And Parkinson's UK do state that those cells, like dopamine producing cells, die. Now, the significance of this in relation to potentially the treatment side is, as the level of dopamine released into the body continues to decrease, less dopamine becomes available to bind to those receptors that the brain, through constant release of dopamine, has increased on other cells across the whole body. So the outcome is that potential for that artificial dopamine that is given, i.e. the L-dopa, can bind to those receptors. And as a result, this may explain why some of the research coming out is suggesting that L-dopa is toxic. Now, let's compare this whole situation with what was happening in diabetes 20 years ago. Both type 1 and type 2 diabetes are characterized by progressive pancreatic beta cell failure. That is a quote from a paper published in 2005. Now, connected into that is this, also another quote from earlier. It is often believed that insulin resistance is the major cause of glucose intolerance in type 2 diabetes. The resistance cannot be overcome by increased production of insulin by the beta cells. And as a result of that resistance and not being overcome, the demands is placed so much on the beta cells that those beta cells can't manage that demand and they die. That's what was believed to be happening back then. We know that's not the case anymore. And 20 years ago, the research was very much focused on insulin. As type 2 diabetes research developed and expanded, it was very much focused on insulin. Let's look at what's happening in Parkinson's. Well, in this slide, it shows you that the most credible form of treatment being looked at today and being researched is an artificial dopamine, like an artificial insulin. So L-dopa is what everything's exploring. This has led me to wonder, are we feeding an artificial intelligent body system by providing this L-dopa so that when it can no longer come, it is being provided and it will bind to those high levels of receptors being expressed, and therefore the cells that should be producing that dopamine don't feel the need to be able to actually produce the dopamine. They don't need to because it's been provided. Now, that means that our current treatment approach is actually feeding that dopamine imbalance because of the dopamine receptors. Those dopamine receptors which are expressed at a high level, they're taking away that dopamine on a constant basis. Shouldn't it be about enabling the body to rebalance, and perhaps by reducing the demand for dopamine, i.e. those dopamine receptors, we need to do something activity-wise that helps us to bring down those dopamine receptor expression. So what's all this connected? How does this all connect into shedding light on preventing winter blues? A strange question, you may wonder. I was asked to give a presentation on this subject just a few days ago. When I originally did this, it was in January, and it was time to come out on that day in January, which we believe is the peak of levels of depression. Now, if we look at this in more detail as to what happens and what is going on perhaps in nature as well as what happening in the world of the human beings, it's a big contrast. On nature, on the left-hand side, to illustrate this, we have hibernating, potentially going into hibernation, the hedgehogs, and the lovely autumn colours and autumn leaves, etc. And then on our right-hand side, we have what we seem to do from around October onwards through until the new year. Now, this is quite a contrast, because on the left-hand side, we've got what we'd say is rest and repair. And on the right-hand side, the only way I can probably describe this is party, party, party. How does this all look from a point of view of maybe our metabolic health, etc.? Well, if we look at the party, party, party part, excuse me for that, but placing metabolic health out of balance with excessive demand for insulin because of the nature of the foods that we seem to be consuming. Then we're reducing the time in daylight because of the nature of our activities through the day and maybe into the evenings. That's disrupting our circadian rhythm. And we're also dysregulating our body temperatures via the fact that we often have overheated rooms, the clothing that we use, and obviously our love of hot baths for many of us. So how does this relate to the point of view of the science or the consequences in terms of the science? Well, unhealthy sleeping patterns and disrupted morning daylight hours can lead to untimely release of melatonin, and that can alter the natural balance of dopamine and serotonin levels. Dopamine, as we've seen, are very much involved, obviously, in pleasure, etc., and that we know is called the happy molecule as well. And the serotonin levels, as we also know, they're very relevant to this field of anxiety and depression. Also, unhealthy sleeping patterns on morning daylight hours can imbalance glucose metabolism and altering the natural balance of insulin levels through untimely release of insulin. That is a key hormone regulating blood glucose levels. Now, that is also relevant because unhealthy eating patterns can lead to untimely insulin release and insulin resistance, which then alters the natural balance of dopamine. Plus, dopamine is associated with regulating insulin secretion. So you can see the picture that's being created here. The demands on dopamine are extremely high, and this whole interaction with dopamine, serotonin, melatonin, etc. makes it quite an interesting dynamic of how do we look at ways to perhaps rebalance all these things. Well, maybe the answer lies with nature. Does aligning with nature hold that answer through rest and repair? Here's just a few examples of what I'm meaning. We are resting the metabolic system through fasting to repair mitochondria. Nature is unplugging from activities that demand energy and mitochondrial activity. And as you know, mitochondria, the amount of work that's going on to look into mitochondria and the answers this seems to be providing is very, very significant. So that's one side. Then there is a retuning of the body clock. That's really important. And the regulating of the body temperature naturally. So nature is going through this whole period so that when we come into the spring, we go through almost like a refreshed renewal of growth, etc. So could the answer to halting and possibly reversing those imbalances that can lead to Parkinson's and its progression be, in one word, and this is meant to be a little light-hearted, simples? Perhaps not quite as simple as it may seem there, but there are many aspects of what we can do in terms of behaviors that we can look to change. I understand it's not always that straightforward and that easy to do. you do need that support network around you. You do need those people and that help to be able to demonstrate and help you through and be that support to you. And sometimes, as has been shown by one man in a related video, Krishna, a kick up the backside in that slang is something that often can work wonders. But I do really honestly believe that there is very good reason to be hopeful. And I believe that the future for Parkinson's in terms of its treatments and the way that we address these issues looks a lot healthier now than it did a few years ago. I know that there's a lot of talk around the importance of exercise, and that is key, no doubt. But if you look into the history of diabetes and what went on then, it also talked about the exercises being critically important too. But if we can address some of those other aspects that I hope have been outlined in this talk, then I think there is, as I say, very good reason to be hopeful and optimistic. But this whole presentation through this one and the previous two is really why, for me, it is my hope and passion to create what I've called emotional health services with an outcome of centering the person to empower them in preventing and healing themselves and others from the physical and mental imbalances that can be triggered by what I've termed acquired mind injuries. So thank you very, very much for listening to this one and perhaps the other two. I will be adding to this series in the coming days and months, so I will let you know more about those, and I look forward to speaking with you again. Thank you. Goodbye.